experimenting. Hi, I'm your host, Milica Hinic, kicking off the series with an episode from Student Learning Podcast Experience. A rewind to December 21st, 2022. What? Yes, I intentionally did this. I wanted to save this specific episode as a precursor to my master's research project. It's an experimentation of podcast structure, format, and method. Topics on peer review, podcast professor relations, and lastly, academic knowledge and creation. Who is this knowledge for? So we are hitting the rewind. Do we even do this anymore? Is this allowed? Well, we're going to do it today. Play button. Where is it? The Student Learning Podcast Experience, a podcast about a podcast. Interview with Hannah McGregor. Enjoy. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we meet on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Giving acknowledgement, even in this Zoom space, it is a step towards reconciliation, recognizing that it is only one step towards equity and decolonization. So I'm Milica Hinic, back to you today on our Student Learning Podcast Experience, a podcast about a podcast. Welcome. I would like to introduce you to my co-host and co-researcher, Dr. Christine Quayle. She's an associate professor for the Department of Communication Studies and Media Arts and Gender and Social Justice program at McMaster University.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Oh my gosh. So where do I start? Hannah McGregor is on our podcast. For those of you who are not familiar with her work, she's an academic podcaster, Which Please, Secret Feminist Agenda, an associate professor of publishing at Simon Fraser University, and is an author to her new book, Sentimental Education, and more. So please do tell us about your wonderful self.
What's the more? Oh, well, I'm delighted to be here. I am coming to you from Vancouver, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. What is currently known as Vancouver is in fact shared territory among those three nations. So there's sort of this like Venn diagram overlap, and then the territory sort of extends in three different directions. So it's it's been a really interesting, different experience living in Vancouver than say in Edmonton, which has its own sort of different histories of territorial sharing. And you are getting me on sabbatical, which means that I am just the most unruly version of myself. I just haven't been in a classroom, haven't been in an office in, I guess, just about 4 months now. And I record all of my podcasts here from my floor where the sound is better. And so I'm just delighted. I don't even know what we're talking about. That's how unruly I am. I'm like, yeah, absolutely. I'll come on your podcast, talk to you. What are we talking about? Yes. Couldn't tell you.
Well, the reason we invited you to our student learning podcast, and it's a mouthful, by the way. I didn't really think about the title when I was doing it. I was like, yeah, this is a great project. This is awesome. But the title needs to be shorter because when people ask me, I'm like, la, 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 and they're like, huh? So yeah. Anyway,
academic titling conventions where everything has to have like a colon and then a whole entire second title.
You are the chosen one because we've been exploring the use of podcasts in the realm of academia.
As an associate professor in publishing, what we were wondering is, from your sort of expertise in podcasting, have you seen academic podcasting increasing lately?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It is extremely on the rise. When I started my position at SFU, which was in 2016, it was still a very sort of brand new exploratory medium to be using in academia. And it was at the time used almost exclusively in classrooms and almost exclusively either as lecture supplements. So like we'll record the lectures and then make them available so students can re-listen to them, which was a, like innovative thing pre-pandemic. And then used as student assignments sometimes. And I still remember doing a literature review with a graduate student of mine at the time, Megan Ryland, who found all of this research saying like academics are perfectly happy to use podcasts in our classrooms, but we are incredibly hesitant to make them ourselves. And what is at work there? And I do think that it sort of demonstrates a tendency for a lot of us to be more experimental in the classroom than we are in our own sort of professional practice. That teaching is often a space where we're like, yeah, okay, let's play around, let's innovate, let's try different things. But then when it comes to your own research production, it's like single authored articles in traditionally peer-reviewed journals only, the end. So at the time I was seeing some classroom experimentation, definitely, and very little interest in academics actually making podcasts. And the ones who did were doing it like in secret, like off the side of their desks, not putting it on their CVs, not talking about them. And over the 6 or 7 years since then that I've been doing this work, there has been a massive expansion in podcast studies as a field, in the publication of scholarship about podcasts, in the development of courses that teach podcasting, both as a form of media production, but also as a like communications and media studies topic that like actually talk about podcasts, where obviously you're going to listen to podcasts in those classes because that's your object of study. But also a huge expansion in the number of academics who are making podcasts and students who are like making podcast dissertations and podcast master theses. There's been a real rise in how much people are using this medium to play around with what constitutes scholarly knowledge production.
What do you think's behind that shift and more people being more willing to dip their toes into the podcast world with their scholarship?
Yeah, I think that there's a few things. I think that academia tends to be quite a conservative and slow to shift world. And so it is in part just that podcasting got mainstream enough that it finally managed to trickle its way into our very, very behind the times field. Right. We get to everything about a decade later than the rest of the world does. So I think that's part of it. And then I also think that it's part of a larger conversation that has been unfolding over the past, 5 to 10 years about really rethinking what we think academic knowledge production is for and who it's for. And those are conversations that are tangled up in shifting attention to knowledge mobilization and the idea that like creating specialized knowledge and paywalling it and hiding it behind inaccessible jargon is like maybe not the best thing that we could be doing with the knowledge we're creating in the university. But also conversations about open access, which are just the very idea that like in Canada, all of our institutions are public institutions. We are all publicly funded. The research we produce is a public good. People should be able to access it. And so I think podcasting lends itself, being a sort of innately open access medium, it lends itself to those kinds of open access experiments as well.
And even some of the granting agencies are now requiring that our knowledge is shared through open access venues. So
yeah, absolutely.
That can play to it.
And when you so SSHRC, for example, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, which funds all the social sciences and humanities research in Canada, has requirements both for open access publishing and for knowledge mobilization. So you have to, when you apply for money, you have to demonstrate both that you will produce some research that will get published, a place that will satisfy the open access requirements. And you have to demonstrate that you are thinking about mobilizing your research to multiple publics beyond your immediate sort of disciplinary peers. And SSHRC distinguishes between those things. But if you can do them both at the same time, that's even better. This is my argument for podcasting. I'm like, why do both when you could just do one? Just make a podcast. And then there you go. It's open access and you mobilize knowledge.
Do you think that there might be any other barriers for academics engaging in podcasting besides just the sort of slow uptake? Or
yeah, absolutely. I mean, we are, again, academia is a very conservative institution and very slow to recognize experimental forms of scholarship. And I think one of the biggest barriers is the expectation that even if people are making podcasts, they will still do all of the conventional scholarship in addition to that to prove that they are quote unquote legitimate scholars. So you see this with graduate students who are like, you know, allowed to make a cool PhD dissertation, but are actually still expected to write an entire traditional dissertation on top of that, you know, and then you see a lot of people who are doing really interesting, innovative work, but are expected to still be publishing at the same level as their colleagues in addition to that. And that expectation burns people out so fast. It doubles your labor. And so it becomes this like, okay, well, am I going to innovate and do twice the work? Or am I just going to do the thing that is expected of me that's going to get me the degree that I'm trying to complete or the, you know, tenure I'm trying to achieve? So it really, a lot of the ways that we organize academia as a system de-incentivizes innovation.
Right. Yeah, that's a good segue to our next sort of series of questions about the peer review process and some other institutional changes that we see you sort of at the vanguard of. So, Milica.
Yeah. So what got me interested with your work was the whole idea of peer review podcasting. The Amplify Podcast Network, their mission, quote, committed to supporting the creation of new scholarly podcasts while building infrastructure that supports them, unquote. So this includes the peer-reviewed podcasts, digital preservation tools, and open access, like you said. So how did you come up with this idea? Tell us more about the network.
Absolutely. So this was an experiment born out of a collaboration with Siobhan McMenemy, who is the managing editor at Wilfrid Laurier University Press. And Siobhan had just stepped into that role. She had been at University of Toronto Press for ages and had just stepped into her role at WLU right when I got my job at SFU. So we were both kind of like brand new to these new positions. And we got chatting at a conference one day about podcasting. I was already doing some podcasting. I was making Witch Please, but there was no expectation that that would be like a peer-reviewed thing or something that I would try to make people recognize as a scholarly publication. That for me is like a public pedagogy project, which kind of fits in a different category. But we got chatting about, you know, could the press publish podcasts? We know that digital publishing, we've got the infrastructure for it. It's very easy to publish things on the internet. The press has the infrastructure for all of the pieces of scholarly knowledge production, you know, finding peer reviewers and putting things through the peer review process and all of that stuff. So could we bring these two worlds together and create, like, you know, good, entertaining podcasts that are also rooted in scholarship that could also be put through a peer review process? And we were like, well, an interesting question. There's a ton of challenges. What would that even look like? Where would the podcast be hosted? Who would peer review them? What would the workflow be? Would people take the peer review seriously? Like, we had so many questions. So we applied for a SSHRC grant to experiment. And that was Secret Feminist Agenda was the podcast that we made for that experiment. And it was very much an experiment. I had a totally different podcast in mind that I thought was what I was going to make. I originally assumed that I would make a sort of, you know, short run, like 5 or 6 episode series that I would then send to the press. They would put it through peer review. I would revise it. We would publish it, all of this stuff. And then I started making Secret Feminist Agenda for fun. Was chatting with Siobhan one day and was like, okay, I have some thoughts about what I think my scholarly podcast should be. And she was like, well, isn't Secret Feminist Agenda your scholarly podcast? And I was like, no, that's not scholarly. That's just a podcast where I talk to scholars about their scholarship. That's not a scholarly project. Haha. And so we decided to make that our test case, but I was producing it weekly, which meant there was no way that peer review could happen prior to the episodes going up. Peer review takes like 6 months to a year. And I was producing these episodes like Thursday night to go up on Friday morning. And so that became one of our first really interesting challenges, is the timeline of podcasting and scholarly publishing is so different. So in this particular case, we decided to go with a kind of summative review, where at the end of every season, the press sought out peer reviewers who would reflect on and respond to that season and produce a review of it. And I would then use that feedback in my development of the subsequent season. And we also opted to make the peer review open and public, which means that all of the peer review is just published on the press's website, because we thought, we're focusing on openness here, so we want things to be open. So that was its own set of challenges. And really that project was about playing around and figuring out what worked and what didn't, and figuring out what questions we hadn't even realized yet needed to be asked. Like we hadn't figured out yet that like something that would be really important was figuring out how to attach a DOI, or a digital object identifier, to podcast episodes so that they will appear in Google Scholar when people look up your work, because otherwise they aren't visible within the academic ecosystem, and that continues to sort of exclude them from research, even if they're published by a press. So we learned a lot of things through that process. And then the Amplify Podcast Network was the next step to say, okay, let's try to implement a bunch of the things we learned in the first phase of this. Let's bring new podcasters on. Let's add in some components that try to solve some of these problems, and just keep experimenting. And that's, we've just kept experimenting and figuring out like, okay, let's try this way. Oh, that doesn't really work. Okay, let's try something different. And I do have to remind my my collaborators all the time that like, this is research, which means you can try a thing and it cannot work, and that can still be a meaningful research outcome. It doesn't all actually have to go well, which is really nice.
Still alive and kicking in 2022. So what is your peer review process like? And how is it different than a book manuscript review or an article being reviewed in a journal?
So for Secret Feminist Agenda, we did that sort of summative peer review. For the new podcasts being produced as part of the network, we are returning to a sort of more traditional workflow, in the sense that the episodes are produced, go through a preliminary editing process with our supervising producer, Stacey Copeland, and with Siobhan, who is the editor. And then once they're ready, they will go out for peer review, get the feedback. The podcasters will have the opportunity to revise them, and then they will be published. So in that sense, they follow a lot of the conventions of book peer review, which a big revelation for me when I started collaborating with the press is that a lot of the things I took for granted about how peer review works are actually things that are true almost entirely of journals, not of peer review writ large. So, for example, for scholarly presses publishing monographs, the peer review is only ever single anonymous rather than double anonymous. So you anonymize the identity of the peer reviewers, but you don't attempt to anonymize the identity of the author. Whereas with a lot of journals, the expectation is that everybody involved is anonymous. And so that immediately, when you're talking about journal publishing, it's really tricky to make a podcast anonymous because it's in your voice. It's kind of a real giveaway, but that's not the expectation for books. And so that, is a problem we didn't have to overcome. We are continuing to talk about whether we want the peer review to be open and public. Will other people be able to engage with it? If so, in what form? But really, what I have learned is that peer review, when implemented thoughtfully, is already a pretty inherently flexible system. So a lot of journals, the way it works is you submit your manuscript, anonymized, all identifying features stripped from it. The editors take a quick look, check that it's, appropriate subject matter and there's an actual article there, take a look at the topic, and then send it out to peer reviewers. And the peer review process takes as long as it takes. It can take 6 months, it can take a year. Depends on how fast they read it. It depends on how many revisions they request. And it's this very sort of dehumanized and generic process. And often kind of as a result of the fact that it's dehumanized and generic, kind of a little cruel sometimes. Like, I think most of us who are publishing in journals have had the experience of getting a peer review back that's really mean. And it's like, oh, you would never say that to my face. This is extremely mean. But none of that is inherent to peer review. None of that's necessary. What peer review actually is a process whereby other experts in the field read your work and respond to it to ensure that it is correct, sort of asterisk, because actually the fact-checking function of peer review is not particularly effective, as lots of studies have demonstrated. But really, ideally, just work with you to make the work better, so point you towards citations you didn't know, or contemporary conversations that you weren't aware were happening, or help you sort of reformat your argument so that it's working better. And in that sense, you can peer review anything, as long as you've got some other experts who are willing to generously and critically engage with your work. It kind of doesn't matter what the medium is.
Yeah. With all of these new ways of creating knowledge and all of these different knowledge mobilization projects and outputs that you were talking about earlier, finding ways to be more flexible and be more open to different kinds of formats seems really important as we continue with them. Trying to make those connections with the public. So we were wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your courses and how you design your courses, and do you incorporate podcasts? And if so, do you incorporate them as assignments, as materials for students to listen to, assignments for students to make, delivering your course material, using for guest lectures like we were talking about earlier? So how do you bridge, or do you bridge that scholarly podcast life with your pedagogical practice?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a sort of particularly streamlined relationship because I don't teach what I research. So, my research is like feminist media studies for the most part, and then scholarly communication. So the content of my podcast is feminist media studies, and then I also sort of research the form of my own research. It's all very meta. But I teach in a publishing program where I teach primarily how the Canadian book publishing industry works. I teach a course about publishing and social change. I teach a publishing history grad course. And so there isn't any obvious way to sort of link those things. And so I'm always seeking to incorporate unusual approaches to scholarly communication into how I design my courses, in the sense that I don't assign essays. Instead, I really encourage my students to think about when they are sort of creating work, to think about what medium that work will be produced in and why, and what are the logics of that medium. And so, for example, in my publishing and social change course, I will teach students, like we've got a unit on podcasting. And the way that it works is that we read some scholarship about podcasting and talk about it. And then we listen to some podcasts and talk about them. And then they make their own podcasts and think about what they have learned through the act of actually making them. And I do that with a bunch of other, like we do a unit on zines and we do a unit on posters. And, so we're trying to sort of think in a very material and concrete way about different mediums, their different affordances, their different histories, and how what you are trying to communicate, whatever that sort of subject matter is shaped by the actual medium that you're working in. And in my publishing history courses, I tend to use podcasting as one of many options for how students will produce publishing histories. So again, I try to focus on like, we're going to learn some stuff, but we're really going to think about how to like do research and then synthesize and communicate research with a real focus on the like, okay, how are we communicating this and to whom? So again, podcasting is always like there as an option, but alongside a bunch of other possibilities. So in the past, I've had my students will often do like remediation assignments. So I'll have them sort of look at a historical published artifact of some variety, research its history, and then attempt to sort of republish it for a contemporary audience, thinking about what is the role that the medium had in its moment, and then what is a medium that has a sort of equivalent social role today. And so they'll do just like wildly creative things, just things that I would never have thought of in a million years. And I love not restricting them to the form that their scholarship can take, because when I say you can literally make anything you want as long as you can justify to me why you chose the form that you chose, they come up with things I would never have come up with to articulate in the assignment.
Yeah, that's great. How do they report back on their learning and what they got out of the assignments and the course?
They definitely always have a sort of moment of panic when they don't get the structure they're expecting. Like one of the main things that students learn in school is how to be students. And so when you're like, cool, I want you to like do things differently, they're like, but I know how to do the thing I've been taught to do in every other class. So can I please just do that more? And I'm like, no, I don't want to read your essay. Sorry. So there is often sort of that moment of free fall. But what I hear back all the time is that people are so much more proud of the work that they've produced when they feel like it is work that they could share with literally anybody else, work that they could include in a portfolio when they go out in the job market, work that they could share with friends and family, work that belongs to them rather than being, an essay that they wrote down and then handed it to me. And then I read it and then I threw it in the paper shredder and then we never speak of it again. And there goes all your intellectual labor. Gone immediately. We'll never think about that essay again. But when you've made a podcast, maybe you will think about it. Maybe it lives online somewhere. Maybe you'll get somebody else to listen to it. Maybe when you're applying for a job and they're like, we're looking for somebody with media production skills, you can be like, hey, look, I made a podcast episode. So I often hear students say, one, that they have more fun making things that are not conventional, for sure, but also that they feel a greater sense of ownership over that work.
So going forward with decisions around podcasts, what impacts decisions? Several things. You want to elaborate on that? Time, class size, course topic.
Oh, delivery. Like what impacts my decisions about how I'm going to incorporate podcasts into my course? Yes, absolutely. Topic, definitely. It's, I'm always trying to make sure that the activities that I am having students do support the learning of the content. And so I have experimented in the past. For example, the course that is absolutely the hardest to teach is this third year level, the structure of the book publishing industry in Canada, which is just such a wildly boring course. And so I'm always trying to figure out, like, how do I teach this in a way that it feels even remotely meaningful to my students? And one year I collaborated with the OJS librarians at SFU, and we created basically like a journal as a class where like all of the students sort of wrote a contribution to this journal and then went through the peer review process and published the final thing. And the feedback that I got where the students were like, it was too confusing because we were studying like trade book publishing, but we were making a scholarly journal, and that it didn't match up. Like if it was a course about scholarly journal publishing, perfect. Let's make a scholarly journal. We'll learn by doing. But it was too many different things at the same time. And so I try, not to, for example, push podcasting into a course that is about trade book publishing.
Yes.
Where it's like, well, am I also going to teach you how to make a podcast while I am trying to teach you to understand how the Canada Council funding structure works? Like, probably not. Probably we're going to focus on other, activities that will actually support the learning for this course. Whereas in a publishing and social change course, it's much easier for me to be like, okay, podcasts, let's talk about them. Let's make them. Let's listen to them. Let's really sort of incorporate that. And it's certainly the case that it is always easier to experiment with a smaller class, just because when you really experiment, things will go wrong. And it is easier to troubleshoot for 15 people than it is to troubleshoot for 100 people. And so, when I try a totally different thing with my grad seminar and it goes sort of hilariously, chaotically wrong, we can all just sit down in a room together and figure out like, okay, this isn't working. What are we going to do? But if you try to do that with like a first year lecture course, it's like, if it goes wrong, you've lost everybody. They're gone. They've checked out. They're not coming back.
No.
Yeah. So, it is just that the ability to play and experiment really, like, I think you need more structure the bigger your class is and the earlier the class, like the more junior the class is. So often the way it will work for me is that I'll start with my experimenting at my sort of higher level classes and then let that experimenting trickle down once I've started learning things. Once I've sort of figured out how to make this thing work.
That's a great process, actually. Process of elimination.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, exploring your podcasting work, I enjoyed listening to some of your podcasts, which please, in each episode was really engaging. Conversations were natural. They felt real. So how would you describe your academic podcasting voice and tone?
Yeah. So my academic podcasting voice is very aligned with my teaching voice. And those have been voices that I have developed in tandem with each other. I started making Witch Please in 2015. I started teaching really, like, that was the same time that I started teaching full time. I'd been a postdoc prior to that and then a graduate student. So, teaching one course a semester, maybe. But 2015 was when I actually started, being a full-time teacher and really started trying to figure out who I was as a teacher and how I wanted to approach teaching. And then meanwhile, here I was also learning how to articulate complex ideas for a wider public beyond the usual audience for scholarship. And those things in many ways went hand in hand, and also in many other ways are wildly different. Because, the podcasting part is just kind of the lecture part, which is actually a very small part of teaching. People often say to me when they listen to Witch Please, which is very teacherly, right? It's Marcel and I teaching some sort of topic. People will say like, oh my God, it must be so fun to take a course with you. And I'm like, I assure you it's more fun to listen to a podcast that I've made. Because in the course, there has to be like assignments and activities. I make you do a lot more work. I actually almost never lecture in my classes. I almost entirely just make my students do everything. Because I'm not actually convinced that it's a particularly effective tool in the space of the classroom. I don't think it uses the classroom effectively. If we're all going to gather in a space together, there's way better things that we can do than me talking at you.
Mhm.
And if you want to listen to me talk at you, I made a bunch of podcasts. Go listen to this. It's fun. Go do that. So it's interesting because they did develop side by side, and also at some point sort of diverged, right? That I like make this medium where I talk a lot, and then I get into my classroom and I'm like, I will talk for 5 minutes. Now it's your turn. I spend so much of my classroom time just walking around while students do things, which used to give me a lot of anxiety when I was a brand new teacher, because I was like, I'm not teaching hard enough. But it's like, actually, this is like, it's much more useful for me to like thoughtfully design a course with various scaffolded activities that the students engage in, that I'm there to like make sure they understand what they're doing and then give them feedback. Like, and none of those things involve me standing at the front of the classroom gesticulating excitingly.
No, really?
No. A little bit of that, a small amount of exciting gesticulation.
You swayed into a totally different direction.
Yeah.
You changed your process.
I changed my process. I really did. And
what works?
I think I don't teach any big lecture classes right now, but we are thinking of developing some in our undergraduate minor. And I think that a sort of mixed, like for those bigger classes where there is a lecture component, I would be really interested to try the like podcast as lectures method, because I do think that they go hand in hand so beautifully. And I know, like, for me, I can't sit and listen to somebody talk at me and retain any of that information. But I retain podcasts very well because I can go for a walk and do other things while I'm listening to them, and then re-listen if I got distracted. Vital.
Yeah.
You know, phased out for 10 minutes. If you phase out of a live lecture for 10 minutes, you just missed it. You just press back a bunch on my podcast player. So I do think that there's a lot of value in that. And I also think one of the big things I've learned in the pandemic is that actually being able to be in a space together is a really rare and special and valuable thing, and that you should use that time well.
I agree.
Sorry. So I'm wondering about how you decide to strike a balance between the like mode of presentation in your podcast, and how do you keep it interesting for your audience and fun and exciting and lively, and at the same time having that, you know, communicating those concepts in a way that is accessible but not so undermining of the nuance of the concepts and arguments and philosophies. So how do you find that balance?
Oh, I mean, practice is a big part of it. You know, I learned how to get a better sense of what needed to be explained by making episodes and having people be like, I did not understand that. And being like, okay, need to explain more there. Need to give people a little bit, you know, you figure that stuff out through trial and error. But I think really, really central to the tone that we've managed to strike in Witch Please in particular is the fact that it's always been a collaborative and conversational project. So there is always built into it both the fun of making a thing with my friend, that we can laugh and, you know, we enjoy each other's company, so it's very easy to bring that energy in, but also the fact that we're there to interrupt one another and ask one another questions, so that if you do start going too far down a rabbit hole or getting too granular or getting to, you know, that the other person can say, wait, sorry, can we pause? Like, you've got somebody there in the role of the listener to be like, okay, no, wait, sorry, I have become confused. Please take a step back and help me understand this. And that has gotten sort of even better for us since the 2020 reboot. We now have a producer as well. And our producer is like a very smart person with an undergraduate degree in the arts who's good at listening. And so, you know, she's there. She just is on mute throughout the episodes. And if she thinks that we've gotten too confusing, she'll just, you know, come on and be like, could you try to articulate that point again? Or I feel like you just talked for 5 minutes and arrived at the point you wanted to make, so I'm going to cut that 5 minutes. Can you just say the point? You just say the point that you got to. So, like, you know, a lot of it is that, like, having a listening ear there while you are doing things, which is so, you know, when you're lecturing, it's very hard to get the feedback of like, you know, you're like watching student faces and being like, are you confused or bored? Are you you're looking at your computer? Does that mean you're taking notes, or are you watching a TikTok? I have no idea. I have no idea what to do with whatever reaction I'm getting from you right now. But, you know, when you're making a podcast with somebody else who you trust, it's much easier to get that like live feedback and be like, okay, let's try that again. Let's do another take of that. Let's try to explain that thing better. And I think that really helps. I mean, it's kind of the best version of team teaching. I had a really terrible team teaching experience once where the professor who I was team teaching with really thought that the most interesting thing that we could do was debate in front of the students. And so whatever point I tried to make, he would try to challenge me on it. And because he thought that was like a fascinating pedagogical experience for the students. And I was like, no, I hate this. This is very bad. This is very bad for me and I don't enjoy it at all. And he was like, oh, but you're so good at it, which is a real, yeah, I don't find debate a particularly interesting or exciting way to produce knowledge. And I think it's particularly not interesting in the classroom, but collaborating with somebody who you really trust, who you're working together to understand something better, I think can also be a really effective way to learn how to communicate well, how to sort of really hit the tone that you're going for.
Yeah, that brings forward my last point on the Humanities Podcast Network. It's a whole bunch of interdisciplinary scholars, academics coming together at a round table. I tuned into Humanities Podcast Network 2021 this past summer. And you were the chair, the round table. I was doing gardening. I'm just tuning in, doing my thing. And I kept pausing. I was like, I paused it and I'm like, okay, I got to let everything down. I got to write down some notes. And then I was like, you know what? Forget this. I stopped doing my flower bed. I sat down and I actually listened.
My God, made you stop gardening. Incredible.
I stopped gardening. Yeah. Cause I'm like, I went from a passive listener and I shifted into like a full-on engaged listener. And I wrote notes and I was like, you know what? Forget it. Priorities first. I need this podcast info right now. So I admire the work done in podcasting, and it's grown since then, how much you've contributed to the academic podcasting world. And focusing on the future, what are your hopes and dreams for academic podcast communities?
Oh, I would really like for us to continue using podcasting as a way to push back against the status quo. I really don't want it to get sort of incorporated into the university in such a way that it's like, okay, we know how to teach them, we know how to publish them, check. And it just becomes another thing that we sort of do without thinking. I want us to keep using them to push against the edges of what we assume to be the case about how teaching works, how learning works, how research works, so that we can keep experimenting and keep sort of resisting that very like disciplining function of the university. I think podcasts are a fun space to just keep being a little experimental.
Yeah, I like that. Experiential learning at its best, right? Yeah. So final thoughts. What's the biggest takeaway you hope listeners to learn?
Oh, if you are given the opportunity to do the thing the way you've always done it before, or to do the thing in a new way that feels uncomfortable and weird to you, do the thing in the new way. That's my big takeaway.
And I have a signature question that I ask. What is your favorite podcast you listen to?
That is such a hard question because I listen to so many podcasts. And my week is kind of structured around them. Like I've got my Monday shows and my Tuesday shows and my Wednesday shows. Like it's very like, oh, okay. All right. Wednesday podcast. What's out? I will say that the one that I am like the most excited about these days is a quite a new podcast called Shame Spiral. which I mentioned because I was just on it, which was very exciting. But it is a podcast where the host, Ellie Krementhal, interviews artists, writers, comedians about their relationship to shame. And she is herself a comedian and writer, but also a therapist, like
Wow.
as her day job. And so gets really into like, what is our relationship to shame and what does shame mean to us in terms of how we move through the world? And it's such like, there's such intimate, insightful conversations. And for me, such a great representation of the kinds of conversations that podcasting really makes possible. So Shame Spiral, that's my current favorite listen.
Oh, I'll check it out. Thanks for taking time out of your day to discuss podcasting with us.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was our pleasure.
My absolute pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation on academic podcasting, experimenting with podcast scholarship and classroom design. Let me end the episode with sending words of encouragement. It's okay to experiment with podcasting. From Hannah, interrupting each other and asking questions is okay. Collaborations advance feedback, sort of like working as a teaching team, which can be instantly gratifying or mortifying. COVID has taught us to utilize in-person time well. And podcasts are a fun space to be experimental. Have an openness and value to podcasts as lecture methods. Check out the show note below in ways to connect with Hannah. Thank you. Ciao for now.